I'm Vicky Hayward and I'm the Chairman of the RSA, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening for this special lecture. Just before we begin, could I ask you to check that your telephones are switched to silent? We're streaming over the RSA website live, so welcome to everybody who's joining us online. And a reminder to everyone that the hashtag is hashtag RSA Culture if you'd like to get involved in the conversation on Twitter. Now, it's my very great pleasure to be able to welcome this evening the Right Honourable Ed Vaizey, Conservative MP for the constituency of Wantage and Didcot. As you may know, Ed was the UK's longest-serving culture minister, holding senior government roles encompassing culture, communications and the digital economy from 2010 to 2016. This summer, following Theresa May forming her first government, sadly, Ed returned to the backbenches, but maybe not so sadly for him. He'll talk about that, I'm sure, in a moment, where he continues to be a vocal champion for the UK's creative and digital sectors. In his lecture this evening, Ed will offer us 6 lessons from his 6 years as Culture Minister and consider some of the current and future challenges and opportunities for the sector and for policymakers. Of course, the subject of cultural policy and how it affects our lives as a whole is a key and important central question for the RSA, whether it's about our education system, how it drives our economy, and as how it enriches our lives individually and as a nation. And it's absolutely the heart of many of the projects that we're engaged in the moment. So it really is a very great pleasure for me to be able to invite Ed to speak to us on this topic this evening. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ed Vaizey.
Well, thank you very much. It's absolutely great to be here. And I was obviously thrilled when Vicky asked me to give this lecture, but also obviously daunted because of Vicky's own incredible track record in the arts, not least in her formidable stewardship of the Royal Shakespeare Company and also her chairing of the Warwick Commission. It's also great to be here with my friend Matthew Taylor. At least I think he's here. I can't see him. We were together a minute ago, and now he's there. I've known Matthew a very long time, and in fact, this is his 10th anniversary of leading the RSA, although I gather no celebration has been planned to mark this momentous occasion. So I'd like to make my first policy announcement from the backbenches that we will have a party to celebrate Matthew's 10 years. I've known him long enough, watching the AGM on the screens downstairs and seeing him wearing a tie. I've known him long enough to remember when he had short peroxide hair. But it's also important for me, as part of the new sucking up strategy from the backbenches, to be here with one of the most important members of the Prime Minister's administration, in Matthew Taylor. So later on he may tell us what it's like to be working in a Conservative government, because I don't know anymore. And thank you all for coming as well. It was wonderful to see you all downstairs waiting to come up to this lecture. It was extremely flattering to see that so many people have decided to come. I know this is an important occasion because my mum is here. She came to the launch of my white paper, and she's come to tonight's lecture. So they're sort of on a par in terms of importance. As Vicky indicated, I left the government in July this year. I almost didn't leave the government because when number 10 rang to tell me the Prime Minister was going to call, I was in my car driving home from my constituency, and they said the Prime Minister was going to call in 15 minutes, and as I drove from Wallingford back to London, I realised I didn't have a mobile phone signal. And so the Prime Minister was in the position of not being able to sack her telecoms minister because he couldn't get a signal. But I pulled up in Henley next to the river, took the call, and didn't throw myself in the River Thames. I served for 6 years. I was thrilled to have such a long period in office, and I was proud of what I achieved. We maintained free admission to our national collections. We gave national museums greater freedoms. We linked libraries to culture through the Arts Council. We ring-fenced funding for music education. We created a new model, the Music Hub. We established English Heritage as a standalone charity. We extended tax credits to theatre orchestras and exhibitions. We made museum storage sexy, and I published the first white paper on culture for 50 years. So you can tell that the first lesson of being Culture Minister is not to be modest about your achievements. But I think one of the ways you get things done is actually not to take too much credit for what goes on. But I thought now that I've left office, I would at least rehearse some of the things I felt I had achieved. But this lecture is obviously an opportunity to reflect on my time in office and draw out a few themes which might be useful when we consider cultural policy. A bit like my white paper, I thought of the title before I thought about the contents. I have called it 6 Lessons from 6 Years, a bit like 6 characters in search of an author, or perhaps 6 anecdotes in search of a thesis. So the first lesson that any arts minister learns is obviously how brilliant the arts and heritage are in this country. Despite the backdrop of austerity, I think we are going through a golden period in the arts, and almost everywhere you look there are examples of outstanding success. Our strength is nationwide, not just in London, whether it's the Whitworth or the Bowes Opera North, the Sage, the Everyman or the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra. I could fill the rest of my time of this lecture talking about the great institutions that exist all over this country. And our national museums, which do have a national presence, have remained ambitious under outstanding leadership, I have to say. That was one of the great joys of being the Arts Minister, working with some really outstanding cultural leaders, all of them very much at the top of their game, and our national museums remaining an exciting and vibrant home for global culture and research. Our performing arts venues, large to the small, followed the same trajectory in my view. Wherever you look, you see organisations that are putting on challenging work and stand comparison with similar venues across the world. Their reputations are international and many are unique. And again, the same goes for our heritage. When I talk about culture, I'm talking about the arts and heritage, and we're blessed in this country, as with other countries, with a wealth of historic buildings. We're in one now. But there are very few countries, I think, that look after them as well as we do, or indeed are as imaginative as in how they attract visitors. Whether it's English heritage, historic royal palaces, the National Trust, our cathedrals, all show a reverence for the past accompanied by an ability to interpret the past in innovative ways for new audiences. And of course, we mustn't ignore the importance of the BBC, a great cultural institution in its own right that supports so much that happens in this arena and is doing even more so under the enlightened leadership of people like Tony Hall and Alan Davey. So many of these institutions are actually global brands. They give so much back to our country, much more than they take out. They sit at the heart of our tourism industry, with millions of visitors coming from abroad in order to visit them. They've got a great impact on our economy. They help, for example, to make London the greatest global city on earth. They feed our creative industries, film, television, design, video games, now the most successful part of our economy. They act as our calling cards around the world. We're known and admired for our creativity. They help the world, if that doesn't sound too pompous, by helping other nations understand and define themselves, as the British Museum did, for example, with its great exhibitions on Germany or the Hajj. And all of this may seem obvious, but it does need to be said. So the second lesson, which is related to the first, is that the arts need love and attention from government. Nothing matters more to the arts community, and nothing is more important than that the government takes what you, do seriously. A new arts minister needs to see and to be seen. But actually, it's even more important that this goes to the very top. The former Prime Minister, David Cameron, gave one of his first dinners in Downing Street for the arts. He and his wife often went to the theatre. But I think he missed an opportunity by never giving a speech about the arts. So I very much hope that Theresa May will find the time to acknowledge properly what I know she thinks, that the arts do a huge amount for our country. Who knows, maybe she could give it at one of the many events next year in Hull when it celebrates being our city of culture. But I also have to say that sometimes the arts can be to blame for the shyness of politicians. As far as I remember, literally every new culture secretary that was appointed when I was a minister was greeted by the arts lobby as a Philistine. I always thought this was a slightly bizarre way to welcome someone upon whom the arts community depends so much. And it perhaps says something about the overall attitude of many in the arts that they fail to see a new appointment as an opportunity to charm and woo the new appointee, rather than with the utterly predictable rolling of the eyes and unremitting hostility. There is another way in which the arts lobby can be predictable, and this is my third lesson. Cultural policy in this country, in my view, is debated in mono rather than stereo. There is, in fact, only one debate: how much money are we going to get? Now, it's true that we made some cuts, so it's perhaps to be expected that I'm being a little passive-aggressive here. But they were smart cuts. While the headline figure of 30% was pretty horrific, the cuts to money that actually went to arts organisations was much lower. And of course, the amount of government funding for arts organisations as a proportion of their overall funding is quite low, so the overall effect on budgets was actually much less. And in addition, the cuts were accompanied by a significant increase in lottery funding that went to the arts and heritage, something that was barely acknowledged by the arts sector. Nevertheless, some of you may have noticed that I have used the freedom of the backbenches to call for an increase in arts funding. We are lucky in this country with our mixed ecology of funding, with income coming from government, donors, and commercial income. It's a unique system which we need to preserve. So although I think arts cuts were not as bad as the headlines, I do acknowledge a general point, that the government still does give very little to the arts in the overall scheme of things, and a little is now having to go a very long way. In my view, we have cut as far as we can. If our museums, our arts organisations, our heritage is to survive and thrive, it must be put on a secure and long-term funding footing, but with a clear quid pro quo that the arts will also continue to do as much as possible to help themselves. And I think there's a great opportunity to do that in the forthcoming autumn statement. But I also do think the debate about arts funding and cultural policy in general needs to be more sophisticated. The debate on funding, for example, tends to focus on inputs. How much money is going in? It never looks at outputs, what is actually happening to the arts in this country. And as I've already said, the arts, in my view, are thriving as never before. Partly this is because, as I have said, arts cuts were actually much lower than people thought, but it's also because many arts organisations responded to the climate with characteristic vigour. Many raised money for the first time. I vividly remember one arts organisation telling me with complete amazement that they had raised £1 million from donors. This was because it was the first time they'd actually ever asked their supporters to make donations. And the cuts that were imposed were accompanied by measures that encouraged philanthropy, the Catalyst scheme, new tax breaks. And I know it is time-consuming and sometimes irritating to spend time raising money, as I will find when I go on an arts board. But my beef with the arts establishment is that far too many conversations with donors tend to end with the cheque. And this isn't just a complaint from a Tory. I remember one Labour-supporting chairman of an arts organisation who gave it significant sums, telling me with not a little degree of anger that he had never once been asked back once he stopped being chairman. Another prominent donor gave a huge sum to their local arts organisation outside London. A few months later, the donor noticed the arts organisation was having a Christmas party. When the donor rang up to ask if they could go, they were told that all the tickets had been sold. Some fear that too much focus on donors will make us too American. Yes, America is different and the culture is different. But I was struck by how many leaders of arts organisations in the US described their donors as their friends and saw them as partners in their organisation. Of course, this can go too far. We don't want a system where the only people on the boards are the rich and the programme is dictated by their taste. But nor do we want a culture where donors who are almost as passionate as the arts leaders themselves are kept at arm's length and regarded with distaste. So far, so obvious. We've got a fantastic cultural environment. Politicians need to take culture seriously. They need to support it prominently. They need to fund it properly. What's next? The fourth lesson is that as far as government is concerned, the arts sit in a policy silo. There is not enough understanding in Whitehall about the power of the arts to make a difference in many different areas, whether it's education, criminal justice, or health. I had some success in education, mainly because of my relationship with Michael Gove. Some of you may want to leave now. Thanks to him, I secured ring-fence funding for music education, the devolution of music education policy to the Arts Council, the creation of music hubs, the incorporation and sustainability of the brilliant In Harmony programme into overall music policy. And I know there are concerns, and I've seen it on Twitter tonight, that the Education Department and Michael Gove let down the arts by the introduction of the EBAC and the promotion of science and technology subjects. And that concern, of course, has been brought into stark relief following the announcement that art history A-level is to be discontinued. But despite that furore, I have never bought the argument that the government downgraded the arts in schools. Great schools and great leaders in schools know that the arts have a huge effect on their pupils' achievements and abilities. Time and time again, I have urged art leaders to engage where it matters with school leaders to make that argument. I do accept that education ministers could and still can do more to publicly make clear what I know is their view, that the arts are a vital part of any school curriculum. And they could perhaps use Ofsted to reinforce that view by ensuring that no school is considered outstanding unless it offers a broad and balanced curriculum that gives their pupils access to the arts. But if I'm giving the Education Department a B+, I can't be as generous to other departments. There's no strategy from the Department of Communities and Local Government to work with local authorities to support the arts. There's no leadership at all from the Department of Health. And we were just getting going on the arts and criminal justice when I left office, partly down to that man again, Michael Gove. So I hope Liz Truss will pick up where he left off. In fact, one of the purposes of my white paper was to try and make some headway in this terrible situation. The idea, for example, behind the Great Places scheme is to try and join up the different silos, to work with local government to come forward with a whole-place strategy to show how local arts organisations can contribute to good health and well-being, to help engage people who are disaffected, who might otherwise choose the wrong path, to enhance the educational attainment of young people. What's happening now, for example, in Hull is great. It's generously funded. But it's a great example of what can be achieved. I know there's great concern about the effect of local authority cuts, and of course it's tempting to blame the government, and perhaps some responsibility lies in that direction. But I also want to balance that point and say this: there is still a choice. Local government leaders who believe in the arts have been able to continue to support them. The RSA, as you would expect, has played an important and imaginative role here. Their Heritage Index is a fabulous example of the nudge agenda, encouraging those who do well in heritage to redouble their efforts and those that do badly to examine why and re-engage. And I think, incidentally, while I'm talking about silos, one very good example of joined-up thinking, in my view, is actually the move of the Office of Civil Society to the DCMS. I think it strengthens the department, but also, crucially, it relinks the big lottery with the other lottery distributors, and it allows ministers to take an overview of the work of so many different sectors, arts and heritage, charities and libraries, in local communities. So I think it is emphatically a good thing. So 4 lessons so far. The arts are brilliant. They need proper support from government, including better funding. There needs to be more joined-up thinking, but still pretty conventional thinking, perhaps. My 5th lesson for the arts is that they are, in my view, paradoxically, far too conventional. I think there is massive groupthink in the arts sector, both in terms of cultural policy and in terms of cultural offers. Let's not beat about the bush. The arts are relentlessly left-wing. Anyone right-wing probably works at Christie's. As Munira Mirza, the former mayor's head of culture, once famously said, well, it was famous to me because I was sitting on the panel when she said it, there is no pro-fox hunting play. Indeed, there are no plays about overpowerful trade unions letting down their members in the public. As a Remainer, there is no pro-Brexit play attacking unaccountable Brussels bureaucrats, building a European superstate. There's no play exposing the corruption and abuse in a country like Venezuela. Why not? The arts sit in a silo in Whitehall, but perhaps they sit in a bubble outside of Whitehall, where everyone in the arts community reinforces each other's thinking and cold shoulders people with different points of view. You have to subscribe to the groupthink to get on, and that is not healthy. As Grayson Perry noted in his Reith lecture, I think one of the most rebellious acts done by any artist recently was by Tracy Emin. She supported the Tories. This conservatism, as I've said, is reflected in the approach to cultural policy. There were very few radical ideas put to me when I was a minister. I was only ever asked for more money. The view seemed to be a simple one. No museum or library must ever close. No performing arts organisation must ever be shut down. If it's funded once, it must be funded forever. All must stay resolutely the same. I find this baffling, partly because in my other life, I spent time with young people busily disrupting the status quo, namely the tech industry. It's a hugely vibrant and exciting place to be, although you come across your fair share of interesting people. The possibilities presented by new technology have made people question almost every conventional way of doing things. I don't want to exaggerate. In many ways, tech too can be deeply conventional. Providing you with real-time bus information is very important, but please don't tell me at the same time that you're saving the world. But there is something truly exciting going on, which I don't think the arts are fully harnessing. And I'm not really talking about the adoption of technology. I know that the arts are more digital than ever before, and I'm delighted, for example, in launching his Digital Culture Review, Matt Hancock listed numerous innovations. But the changes we are seeing are more, in my view, tactical than strategic. The thinking, the disruption doesn't go deep enough. Where are the truly exciting collaborations? Why doesn't every museum have a tech hub? Why aren't organisations using data to understand their audience better, to reach out to new audiences? Why aren't there more tie-ups? I've lost count of how many frustrated tech entrepreneurs I've spoken to who find the doors to arts organisations closed to them because, well, they're simply not welcome. There's simply not enough disruption going on in the arts today. And the arts, the point I think is important because technology is just one of the tools available to the arts to enable them to reach new and different audiences. The arts, by and large, remain the preserve of the affluent, the white and the middle class, and those that live in London. And before we turn full circle and argue this is all about money, I don't think it is. It's about the groupthink and the conventional. Too many art forms are still presented in deeply conventional ways. Museums remain intimidating places. Our great-great-grandfathers could turn up to a classical music concert and find it comfortably familiar. There's very little attempt to get out from behind the Victorian facade or the concert hall, and that needs to change. Who is rethinking what a museum is, what a theatre is, what an orchestra is in the 21st century? Why do we still cling to a 19th century model of a passive, respectful audience that is completely alien to so many people? Although I have to say, you're doing a very good job, and thank you for the RSA for giving me this 19th century format. I should have had whiz-bang. I should have proved the point by having some whiz-bang graphics. There also remains, you won't be surprised to hear me say, an appalling lack of diversity in the arts, both in front and behind the scenes. This means the arts are cutting themselves off from new narratives, new stories, new audiences. The Chineke Orchestra, Britain's first black orchestra, has done more in 2 years to raise the issue of diversity in orchestras and foster the careers of BME musicians than the classical music world has done in 20 years. How many organisations reach out to the new tastemakers, the YouTubers, who speak to audiences that they couldn't hope to reach at the moment? And before you accuse me of dumbing down, that phrase exactly encompasses the problem. Nobody who calls on the arts to reach out to new audiences in different and more accessible ways should be accused of dumbing down. Put simply, how long will the conversation stay as one between established organisations seeking more money from government to carry on doing the same thing? I know I'm putting this bluntly. I know I'm putting this unfairly. I haven't acknowledged the great work that I fully know is going on. But I wanted to make the point. For all the great work, for all the innovation, for all the amazing leadership, which I absolutely acknowledge, I still think there is a strain of complacency running through the arts that needs to be challenged. It comes down to a mindset that almost says you're privileged to see us play, not we are privileged to play for you. And that needs to change. In short, the arts need to challenge themselves more. So there you have it, the thoughts of a former arts minister. I think there is a thesis there, and it comes in two parts. Government needs to do more. We've got to recognise how much the arts give us. We, the government, I know I'm not the government. The government needs to recognise how much the arts give us. We've got to defend them. We've got to support them. We've got to fund them. Government and the arts working together must show how important the arts are for every aspect of our lives. They're not just an intrinsic good, they're an economic good, a health good, an environment good, an international diplomacy good. But the arts must also do more for themselves, to reach out, to reach new audiences, to do things differently, not to accept the status quo and a narrow parameter for debate. And of course, in Brexit Britain, this has never been more important. Our country, it seems, is truly divided between rich and poor, between north and south, between country and country. The arts have a huge and important role to play here. They have the chance to give people the opportunity to express their views, to come together, to question, to examine. And that means that the arts must welcome all our communities and speak to and for all of them as well. I will remain their champion, but I certainly won't shy away from challenging them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ed. So,
Well, that flew by.
that flew by, didn't it? You know, it does.
God,
It does.
up there.
I'm amazed when you say that you haven't been asked to speak on this subject. So I'm absolutely delighted, although somewhat embarrassed that that's the case. And I wanted to actually start by also thanking you, because 6 years flies by as well. I mean, actually, it always feels that people who are in government disappear out of government just at the moment when they've had the opportunity to really see everything from the 360. And you did dedicate your time. I mean, I know just how hard you dedicated your time when you were in government representing culture, because it's a really broad brief, and it takes you right across the country, and you actually immersed yourself in all of that, to the point where I think you have absolutely earned the right to be as challenging as you have been this evening, and quite rightly so. And I think the arts community and the creative industries as a whole should welcome that challenge, because, for goodness sake, if we can't in the creative industries have a debate about what's right and what's wrong, and how we're coming across, then I don't really know where we can. I'm going to open it up to the floor in a minute, but I just wanted actually to take the opportunity to ask you to speak a little bit more on your very last point about Brexit, but actually bringing it back to this point about joined-up government, because here we are in an environment where the government isn't entirely joined up in terms of the creative industries, as you were discussing, whether you're talking about education, whether you're talking about industrial policies, whichever area you're looking at. And certainly we can see in Brexit that there isn't a great deal of clarity at the moment in how those negotiations are going to go. How do the creative industries engage with government in a conversation about this in a way that would be constructive and helpful?
Well, I think the Creative Industries Federation has published its report today on Brexit and the impact on the creative industries, and Alex Beard has written a piece in The Standard today as well about highlighting some of the actually very sort of in the detail practical issues about the kind of people that an organisation like the Royal Opera House and others will want to recruit, and the need to allow organisations like that to be able to draw from a talent pool across Europe. So a lot of it is focused on the ability to attract talent. But also I think the arts and the creative industries have this vital role in terms of how we're perceived in the world. I mean, it is an amazing thing, really, to work as a minister where very few of your colleagues acknowledge the role that the arts play, whereas the minute you go abroad, people fall over themselves to talk about the arts and the creative industries in the UK. And the classic example that's always used is China, where they've pretty much worked out how to make things, and what they lack, what they themselves acknowledge they lack, is that creativity and that inspirational thinking, if you like. So I don't want to be patronising to a nation of 1.5 billion people, but you get the point. So we really need to reinforce to the government how important the arts and the creative industries are. I did ask David Davis in one of the debates, about the creative industries, and he said, for example, he's going to sit down with the film industry. So the government gets the film industry because they know that Britain is full of people making movies. But we don't have an industrial strategy for the creative industries. I just looked at the list of sectors from aerospace onwards that the government has got an industrial strategy for. I think it's got one for information technology, which is a sort of lovely 80s phrase. But they don't have one for the creative industry. So that's going to be my big campaign, to get them
1 in 11 jobs and no industrial strategy.
Get them to wake up to the fact they need an industrial strategy for the creative industries. And they do. I mean, there will be a digital strategy coming out of government which will focus on the tech industry, and that will be half the piece. But they need to acknowledge the importance of the wider creative industries and the arts. And I know we all have this debate, intrinsic versus utilitarian, if you like. But, the arts need to say, we are an important part of this economy as well, and we want to be part of this debate about how we're supported as we leave the European Union.
I'm very interested in you picking up that point about the sort of intrinsic versus instrumental, because Matthew and I were discussing earlier on today, but it's been a sort of ongoing debate at the RSA for quite some time, that maybe in terms of education, we've got slightly lost in this proof argument that, you get one report that says, yes, you can absolutely see the value of culture and creativity in education, then you'll actually get another report which says we can't really measure any benefit at all. And somehow those of us that believe seem to get lost down an endless funnel of a debate, which actually at the end of the day is irrelevant if one actually believes that this sort of thing is valuable. Now, you talked about that this evening, but I wondered if you had any more advice for those of us who are still kind of battling away on the front line about how to create a true sense of value within the educational sector for the creative arts and for creative learning.
Well, I think for a start, I suppose I was probably too robust in my defence of Michael Gove and the EBAC, and I think that to a certain extent one of the frustrations that happened in government was the amount of changes that happened to the curriculum. And I defended him because I wanted to sort of get across two things. One is that I never felt it was an either-or. So I felt Michael had an agenda that he wanted, particularly kids from poorer backgrounds, to put it bluntly, who he felt their life chances had been written off very early in school, to get a robust, rounded education to give them the skills they needed to succeed, and not to accept any excuses for failure based on their background. And also the perennial problem we have had in this country in terms of teaching sciences and technology. So he wanted to compensate for that, but I never felt he wanted to do it at the expense of the arts. But I accept that there was a lot of confusion and a lot of changes in the curriculum which were extremely frustrating. So that was sort of point number one. And the answer to that point is that it is incumbent on government, and there is an opportunity now with new ministers to say to them, you know, it really matters to talk about this, if that doesn't sound too facetious. You know, we got Nicky Morgan to make a speech about it, because she'd been pilloried for a previous speech, which I think, again, I think unfairly pilloried, but she was. And I think the more we can get ministers out there, and I know it sounds a bit like PR, but the more we can get ministers out there endorsing things, you know, going to music education events and that kind of thing, the better. But I think the second point, which was my challenge to the arts, is that there's, you know, you feel when you're a minister, there's too much of people coming to you and saying, you know, sort this out. You know, if you sign a piece of paper, the next day, thousands of pupils will be receiving a high-quality drama, arts, music education. Of course, that won't happen. And I think we forget that we may have a battle with ministers, but we do have a battle with teachers and head teachers as well. And I think there was a sort of paradox going on in the Department of Education. On the one hand, Michael Gove was very hands-on in terms of driving the changes he wanted to see. But at the same time, the whole free school agenda is meant to be giving head teachers and classroom teachers more autonomy. And I don't see why a head teacher should simply say, teach to the test and say, that's the EBAC, that's all I'm going to focus on. That to me is not someone who's got the rounded skills to lead a great school. And there are plenty of head teachers out there who do provide fantastic arts education and understand the value it has in and of itself, but also the wider value in terms of the academic achievement of their pupils. And I think that conversation between the arts sector and those teachers is missing. I know it goes on, but it's missing in terms of the high-profile nature of the debate. So yes, education ministers need to do more, and we need to talk to them about the importance of the arts and their need to shout about that and to make it absolutely clear. And that's why, it's basically a Labour policy, this Ofsted outstanding school policy, but it's one I've happily adopted.
Actually, it was a key recommendation of the
And
Warwick Commission.
Key recommendation of the Warwick
Because the Warwick Commission started it, yeah.
But also, it's part of my challenge to the arts. Stop just simply turning up to government and say, sort this. Have the conversations as well with the people who can make the difference on the ground.
Thank you. So I'm going to open this up. We'll probably take 3 questions and to sort of get the ball rolling. The gentleman right at the back there has his hand up first, and then I'll take the gentleman here, and then this lady here in the second row. Whoever's got the mic. Thank you.
Ian Dodds. I have a black minority ethnic friend who is actually quite a successful actor in theatre and on television. And he is extremely frustrated with the lack of opportunity for BME people in the performing arts. Now, he believes this is because it's actually controlled, in his view, by a small group of people who are ex-public schoolboys who are white. And whether or not he's right in that, I don't know. But you mentioned diversity, and I wondered how you felt it might be possible to increase diversity in the performing arts.
Thank you. Take another question there.
You touched on Michael Gove's concerns about people in poorer areas and giving them greater opportunities. He's just been in the news again about having changed his mind with regard to grammar schools. I'd just be interested to see where you stand on this particular point and any comments that you may have.
Thank you very much. Lady here.
You mentioned that the art sector in general is very closed off to innovation from a tech perspective and to getting access to new audiences. And so my question is, what advice would you give to someone who's doing research in that area and trying to develop new methods to do prediction of what types of films are suitable for which audiences, to get access to the film industry or a collaboration partner in academic research work?
Well, okay, so on diversity, I mean, answering your question perhaps more broadly rather than focusing on the white public school boys, clearly there's a massive issue with diversity and also disability as well. And it's laziness, and it's living in the bubble and not thinking about it. And it is beginning to change. Anecdotally, Kwame Kwame, when I saw him the other day, the play that he put on in Baltimore is now at the Donmar. He said it feels different from 5 years ago, but that's anecdotal. It's not proven. But, I mean, fundamentally, your friend is right. And I have many friends who feel that way and who feel that they are, frankly, typecast in terms of the roles they're asked to audition for. And it needs to change rapidly. And people need to keep pushing, and they need to keep effectively saying it's completely unacceptable in terms of what we see both on stage and off stage. But it cuts across all art forms, and it cuts across broadcasting and film as well. there are lots of things we can do, by the way, in terms of policy as well that can make a difference. Grammar schools, you know, I'm not someone who was worried, thinking that education was suffering because of lack of grammar schools. I strongly supported free schools and academies. My kids are at an academy. I think the transformation of education, particularly in London, over the last 20 years, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, this has been a process that was started under a Labour government, has effectively been carried on, arguably on steroids, by a Tory government. I'll wait to see what the government comes out with on grammar schools. I mean, as far as I'm aware, the position has shifted a bit to say it's more about allowing grammar schools to expand more easily than creating new grammar schools. As far as your question about film and who you could talk to in terms of researching film and tech, I don't have any specific detailed advice about that, but I think I'll riff off your question to say that what I find frustrating, I mean, the way I sort of went about my job as a minister to a certain extent was just to meet lots and lots and lots of people and have conversations with them and put sort of slightly random people together and connect them. And it just feels to me that the point I was really trying to make about tech was not about, you know, although I said it in my lecture, I slightly, you know, if I'd had time to revise it, I probably would have put the point more tightly. It's not necessarily about, you know, how you use data, although that's important, or whether or not you're cinecasting your play. It's more about there are some really interesting people out there doing some very disruptive, changing things. Some of it is very challenging, and some of it is causing lots of ethical issues, for example, you know, in terms of the Ubers of this world or whatever. But they are disrupting things, and they are very switched on and interested in culture, and they regard themselves as creative people. And I don't think enough people in arts organisations are simply, frankly, having those kind of random conversations with people who may not seem to have anything to do with what they're doing within their cultural organisation. But after an hour of chat, they probably would find that they are. But I'm happy to follow up if you want to email me about in terms of film and tech and how they're coming together. Because again, that whole kind of YouTube phenomenon is now morphing into a new way of making films and so on, in terms of short narratives and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much. This lady at the front, and then lady in the centre there, gentleman at the back.
Yeah, well, thank you. My name's Kentius Bryan. I'm in film and the arts, really, theatre, everything. So thank you very much for what you said about the British film industry, and I just want to read something because I don't want to go too verbal. Because British filmmakers are at a disadvantage in an increasingly global market, when in competition with the well-established commercial studios of the US and usually better grant-funded Europeans, which is now, and they usually help us to develop our films because there's not much here. And now with Brexit, we're a bit concerned what's going to happen. And there is a need to redress this imbalance somewhat, and I would really love your opinion on that. Plus, it really is amazing how you can make a social impact with films as well, and for education, for everything. And this year, there's so many films that I've seen at BAFTA that totally enthrall and really touch the button with social impact. There was a particularly British film only shown once this week. It was amazing. So your support of British film would be, your advice of how to get that together under one umbrella would be amazing. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I don't want to go on.
Microphone to the lady in the room.
The question of libraries on one hand and your clear frustrations with communities and local government department. And I wondered if you, with hindsight, and given the rate of library closures across the country, notwithstanding perhaps some economies that may or may not needed to have been taken, there is a real challenge around library infrastructure. And I wondered if perhaps, with hindsight, you might think about, you know, whether as Minister for Culture you might have been able to achieve more if you'd worked collaboratively with those responsible for funding of local government.
There's a gentleman just behind, his hand up there.
Firstly, thank you for a very interesting and entertaining talk. I know you touched on this slightly, but what do you think the effects of Brexit will be on arts funding and on London as a cultural hub more generally?
Okay, so in terms of British film, I mean, we have a dilemma in the UK because of our language, and it means that it's very easy for us to, frankly, for our audiences to feel comfortable with American films, and we don't perhaps have, how can I put this delicately, the insecurity that some other countries have in terms of preserving their culture and therefore putting some funding specifically into that culture. I think it's a good example. British film is also a good example of the tyranny of the arts establishment. I was talking to a senior figure in the film industry the other day in a tea room, and we chatted, and we both said, well, actually, there are quite a lot of very bad British films being made, but you can't say that in public because you immediately get shot down for daring to suggest that films should be made that audiences actually want to see. This is regarded as another aspect of Philistinism. So it would be helpful if we stopped perhaps making costume dramas set in the 1950s of sort of twee English countryside and actually made something that was contemporary and relevant and not necessarily always about people being utterly miserable as well. I hope that British film will continue to thrive, but we do have this dilemma that we tend to supply the US with talent in terms of our actors and in talent in terms of our directors and people behind the scenes. In terms of the next question, which I've now forgotten, libraries. So libraries is fascinating for me. Sorry, I won't, I'm now going totally self-absorbed. So libraries was the issue that was most difficult for me as a minister over the 6 years. And it was I did think very deeply about whether I could have handled the libraries issue better, because when I first came into office, the local authority cuts were really beginning to hit. And the first issue that presented itself was Brent, a Labour authority, Brent, closing 6 out of its 12 libraries. And those of you who are not as absolutely obsessed by library policy as me, and my questioner perhaps, the minister has the power to call an inquiry into a local authority that's closing its libraries. It's only ever been used once when I bullied the previous Labour minister into having an inquiry. It's only been used once in 50 years. And so Brent was an absolutely open goal for me. I was there, the goalkeeper was on his back, the goal was there, and I kicked it over the crossbar because I decided not to hold an inquiry. And the reason was because I looked at what Brent was doing, and they seemed to me to be doing an utterly rational thing, which is they had been trying for 5 or 6 years to close half their libraries because they were in the wrong place, in huge Victorian buildings that would cost an absolute fortune to maintain and to heat, and were barely used. And they wanted to use the savings to run a more effective library service. And of course, once the cuts had come in, there really was nowhere else to hide. Previously, any councillor could just duck it because they knew they would get demos. And I suffered from then on for 6 years being told I was absolutely the most useless libraries minister that had ever lived, despite the fact that I put libraries policies under the Arts Council, which had been the original ambition under the Act. We got money out of the Arts Council to support libraries. We set up a libraries task force, which made some really practical recommendations, which answers your question about local authorities and engaging with them to support their library service. And then just this evening, popped into my inbox a link to The Guardian, where Helen Milner, the head of the Tinder Foundation, which is not the dating app, it's... I've always wondered why they continue to call themselves the Tinder Foundation after Tinder became a thing. But it is about digital inclusion. And she had some pretty strong words to say, which if I had said them, I would have been murdered, which is basically, goes back, funny enough, to the words I'd written in my lecture before I read her words, saying some libraries need to close. We are fed up with bad libraries having a free pass in an age of austerity when tough decisions are having to be made, and there are better ways of serving the community with different services in terms of knowledge and inclusion than a library that nobody uses and isn't fit for purpose. And those are the tough decisions that councils were having to take under our watch. And I felt from the get-go that unless there was a clearly compelling case of councils simply closing its libraries without a thought I wouldn't intervene. And the other thing that happened was that every single library proposal for closures came across my desk. We went through it all with a fine-tooth comb, and every single council had thought very, very deeply about how it's providing its library service. So thank you for that bit of therapy. And I've now, of course, forgotten the third question.
The implications of
The implications for Brexit, you know, what can I say? I mean, the trouble with the current climate is that anyone who says, well, can we just have a think about this, is regarded as unpatriotic, unable to accept the result of the referendum. Look, I'm nervous, you know, I'm delighted by the figures that have come out today about economic growth. I'm delighted that Nissan has confirmed it's going to carry on making cars in Sunderland, but I'm very nervous. And what does that mean for the arts? It means a couple of things. I don't know what's going to happen to our economy. I have said very clearly that I think there should be an increase in arts funding, and an increase in arts funding in terms of the wider government budget is just a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of a percentage, but it makes a massive, massive, massive difference. And it would be such a massive vote of confidence if the government even increased the arts budget by 5 or 10%. It would really, I think, have a real impact. I mean, maybe I live in the bubble as well, but I really think it would make an impact. But so that's one point. So I don't know what will happen in that sense. But the second point, which is perhaps more important, is this whole culture point, the culture of the country we live in at the moment, and whether or not we can, as a society, try and get out of this climate that seems to be getting ever sort of more, really, worrying, of sort of clamping down on people's free expression. So I want us to, this is a wonderful, liberal, open, tolerant society that we live in, and I want us all, and we thrive from welcoming people from all over the world and absorbing and welcoming different cultures into our own culture, and I want that to continue. That's the Britain I love. So I want the arts to be that platform to give expression to that kind of view.
Thank you. So we've got a question coming in here. This lady's had her hand up for a while, and Joyce over there, so it's down to the front here. Is that
Hi, yeah, this is a question that comes via our online audience, so via Twitter from Fiona Leslie Bennett. You say leadership in the arts is great, Ed, but can you explain why you're critical of the arts vision for tech and new audiences, specifically?
You know, I was aware when I was writing the lecture that I started the lecture by saying how brilliant everyone was in the arts, and then I ended it by saying how everyone was rubbish in the arts. But obviously, that wasn't what I was saying. I was trying to be a critical friend. As I say, I think to a certain extent, all of us live in bubbles, and all of us live in silos. And it just seems to me that if I was going to say, I was going to get this off my chest, Matthew wanted, the early thoughts of Hon Ed Vaizey. This was the thing that always went round my head while I was a minister. That I felt that while I meet the most brilliant people who lead the most amazing arts organisations in the most utterly brilliant way in terms of what they're doing, no question. But I just felt there's a lot going on out there. There's a lot of change, and it just felt to me that the conversation was still pretty closed. Is still pretty closed within the arts. So what I'm just saying, you can't help but be slightly crude, and it can rub people up the wrong way, but I'm just trying to say get out more in a sense. Just go and meet different, it's a paradox, in a creative community that is full of free thinkers, that I just felt that to a certain extent there was a bit of a sort of inward-looking conversation rather than an outward-looking conversation in terms of different parts of the community. So, and I just felt as a minister, because I had this access to the tech community as well, that I was meeting a lot of interesting people doing a lot of different things who were dying to kind of work with arts organisations, and found that they just couldn't kind of make any kind of connection. So that's really the point I was trying to make.
Yes.
I'm making less and less sense as we go on.
Not quite. It's sort of two questions, and it's really advice. What advice would you give to the artists in Warsaw at the moment, with what's happening with the gallery, the only sort of cultural space they have, and with their libraries, because they're going to close 15 of their 16 libraries? one of which is a leather museum, which was an old leather museum that they're going to rip out from its Victorian building and place on top of a new glass building. And the second is, how would you advise a cultural disruptor to try and make inroads? What steps would you suggest that someone makes to try and make inroads from the other way into the cultural industry and the sector?
And there's Joy, have you got your mic there?
Thank you. Joyce Aram, a fellow. First, may I say how encouraged I was to hear your comments on the importance of art in education. I'm a grammar school product for my sins or otherwise, but recently at my old school, the old girls' annual reunion there, the headmistress was reporting to us that with government cutbacks, one of the first areas to be cut down on, if not disappearing completely, was our art section. And yet, in my mind, art and history are overlapping and each have something desperately important to give to children. You've only got to look at children living in Wales, particularly those that take part in the National Eisteddfod and the Earth, the Youth Eisteddfod. The children performing there have a confidence and an interest outside of arts as well as the areas that they're training in and performing in that carries on over to other parts. How can we ring fence, for want of a better word, ring fence the funding for the arts in education to make sure that they don't disappear completely?
Thank you very much. 3 questions.
Oh, was it 3?
Yep, you've had your 3.
What was the first one?
First, 1, 2, 3.
So,
Oh, sorry, you've answered this.
Yes.
I'm so sorry, I'm losing track. There you go. 2. Do you want a third one?
Who's been drinking the
This
wine?
lady there.
Are we going to get a third one?
Bixby Langtham, you mentioned what the arts can do for education. I would like to ask you what you think education can do for the arts, both artists and cultural leaders, managers, etc.
Right, okay. So,
That's your wrap-up.
this is my final question.
It is your final question.
Well, obviously, I want to pay tribute to Deborah Williams, who asked the first question, who I've worked with on diversity issues for a number of years. She's absolutely fantastic, and I don't know if I can answer her question in the way she wants me to answer. I mean, obviously, the New Art Gallery in Warsaw is a fantastic institution, and again, it's rooted in Warsaw's history. It's got a collection that's, was donated to the people there, and it's a very sad thing that is happening. But I also wonder whether, I don't know anything about it, so for me to kind of speculate about why it finds itself in the position it is in is interesting. I mean, I'll give you a slightly ridiculous example of which may go badly wrong, but I remember visiting Nottingham Contemporary many, many years ago, and then a few months later I went to visit Paul Smith, the fashion designer, and I went into his office, and it's the most extraordinary space. I mean, it's absolutely bizarre. Brilliant, amazing space. And I wrote to Nottingham Contemporary and said, why don't you do an exhibition of Paul Smith? Because it'll bring in a huge audience of people who live in Nottingham who revere Paul Smith. And they said, I'm sorry, we're an international contemporary art gallery, and it therefore wouldn't suit us. Now, I've no idea. Maybe Nottingham Contemporary is now thriving. I mean, Turner Contemporary is thriving. And I don't, this is the fundamental point behind the question is, is the New Art Gallery in Warsaw closing because the government is imposing nasty cuts? Or is it closing because it didn't engage enough with its council, the people living in Warsaw? Will Turner Contemporary thrive only because it's getting enough money from Kent County Council and the Arts Council? Or will it thrive because it's found a magic formula to both engage its local community and also a community from outside Margate? So it's a very difficult question. But I suppose what I always tried to do as a minister was to say, please don't just take the easy route and say, this is closing because the government is cutting. And I used to, again, I'm being very confessional here tonight, I used to sit up. The Museums Journal used to regularly publish a list of all the museums that are closing because of the evil cuts. And I used to go through every single closure, and literally 95% were for completely separate and different reasons. They were not closing because of cuts. So there's always something going on. That's all I would say. That's the general point. In terms of how can a cultural disruptor get into culture, that's again the fundamental point. There's an element of, to a certain extent, you need permission to join the gang, and that is, every gang you need permission to join the gang to a certain extent. But that is, cultural disruptors can disrupt from the outside by just attracting audiences and doing things differently, or they can disrupt from the inside by getting a partner within the cultural sector, and that's kind of again. Goes back to the message I was trying to push, which is I think the cultural sector needs to be much more open to the disruptors who at the moment are really found in the tech industry. In terms of how you ring-fence the arts and in education, again, I'll sound like a crack record. That is all to do with how I think, yes, government has a role, but how we engage with school leaders. And so I wouldn't let your head of your grammar school off the hook. I wouldn't let them say, we're having to close our arts department because of cuts. I would challenge them and say, really? Do you need to? Do you not see the wider damage you're doing by doing this? Is there no way you can maintain the service? Or are you simply taking an easy route with an easy person to blame? So I would challenge them. What can education teach the arts? I'm not an educationist, but I think that one of the things I did when I was a minister, for example, which was a sort of thing I kind of learnt from, was with TES Global and David Putnam, where we encouraged 6 museums to put their material online. TES Global is a resource which teachers use to write lessons plans. They write lesson plans, they put them online, and then other teachers borrow the kind of most popular lesson plans and so on. And what that taught me was that, there's too much top-down from cultural institutions in terms of their education materials to teachers saying, we'll provide you with the teaching materials because we know what you should be teaching your kids about our institution. And actually, they should do it the other way around. They should say, here's everything we've got. You're the professional, you're the teacher. You use the material we've got in the way you see fit to engage with your pupils. So I suppose I haven't really fully understood the point behind your question, but what I would say is that what education could teach the arts is, again, part of my thesis, which is that the arts need to be much more open to other gangs. The other gangs, whether it's the tech gang or the education gang, can teach the arts a lot, and there needs to be much more of an equal conversation and a partnership between the different gangs than just one cultural gang.
Ed, we could go on all evening because, as you can see, there are many, many more questions. We have the opportunity to continue this discussion downstairs over a very well-earned glass of wine. Thank you so much for this evening. Thank you for everything that you did during your time as Cultural Minister. You were a highly effective Minister for Culture, and you really fought on behalf of arts and culture in this country, and I watched you doing that, and I admired you, and I have every faith, and from the backbench you will continue to fight on our behalf, and indeed join us, as I know you're going to, by joining arts boards and continuing to be a consumer and an absolute champion for arts and education in this country. So thank you so much for this evening. There we go, we can go that way. Oh.